Welcome to the Nushi Health Podcast, where we provide credible, no-hype health, wellness, and nutrition information that actually moves the needle towards better long-term health. Welcome to episode 5 of the Nushi Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Erin Glenn, and today we're talking all about low carbohydrate diets. We're leaving out the ketogenic diet today. We'll cover that in next week's episode. But if you're interested in low carbohydrate approaches for health in general, listen to both episodes because you'll get a really good overview of the differences between these various diets and why one option might be a better fit for you than others. We're going to look at all of these low carbohydrate eating patterns from a scientific perspective, discuss the general principles of each, what health benefits have been shown, how to put it into practice, and we'll take a look at why low-carb approaches have been so controversial in the nutrition world. I am not in any established camp when it comes to low-carbohydrate approaches. I'm not an advocate for them, but I also think that well-constructed low-carb plans can greatly benefit certain people. This series is about helping you find a dietary pattern that works for you, that works with your individual physiology, your health status, your food preferences, health goals. So I can't tell you which pattern will be best for you, but I can review what we know about these different eating approaches, what groups of people they'll likely work better for than others, the pros and cons of each, and how to give them a try so you can make those decisions for yourself. As a general order for today's episode, we're going to start with reviewing important definitions and nutrition basics related to carbohydrates, metabolism, and blood sugar that will be foundational for understanding some of the health benefits behind these low-carb approaches. Then we'll get into the different low-carb approaches that range from a slight reduction in carbohydrates from standard dietary guidance all the way up to periods of excessive carbohydrate reduction followed by carb reintroduction methods. We're looking at the zone diet, the Atkins diet, the South Beach diet, the slow carb diet, and how you can simply reduce your carbohydrates for a lower carbohydrate diet without following a specific plan. Similar in format to our previous episodes in this Food Fit series, we'll talk about the history behind these different approaches, the general principles of each, condition and/or population-specific considerations, things to watch out for, how to try them out, and more. This is the 5th episode in our series all about helping you find your food fit, and I encourage you to listen or watch the other episodes as well if you haven't already. But without further ado, let's get into it. We're starting with some definitions. Remember from episode 1, carbohydrates are one of the 3 macronutrients in the diet. We have fat, protein, and carbohydrates, which we call carbs for short. Carbs include sugars, starches, and cellulose, which is a fiber found in plants. And carbs are basically just long chains of sugars, but they differ in how easily the body can break those chains to access the sugars. Simple carbohydrates, also called simple sugars, are short chains that are easily broken and therefore easily digested and absorbed. These are things like table sugar, lactose in milk, and fructose in fruit. These simple sugars or simple carbs are going to break down quickly and cause our blood sugar to increase quickly. The other type is called complex carbs, found in starches and cellulose. These are longer, more complex chains of sugars that take the body longer to break down, and therefore they don't spike blood sugar as much as the simple carbohydrates. Or in the case of cellulose and resistant starch, we either don't have the enzymes to break down those chains, or they're arranged in such a way that it makes it basically impossible for enzymes to get in and break it down. Complex carbs are found in whole, unprocessed foods such as whole grains, beans, legumes, fruits, and vegetables, which also come with other beneficial nutrients like fiber, vitamins, and minerals. And while I mentioned fructose as a simple sugar found in fruits, whole fruits also contain complex carbohydrates like fiber. While we're focusing on lower than standard carbohydrate diets in this episode, it's important to remember that just because something has carbohydrates doesn't mean it's bad for you. Whole foods like vegetables, fruits, and grains contain complex carbohydrates and lots of beneficial nutrients and compounds, but you can adopt a lower carbohydrate approach and still include these healthy choices in your diet. And we'll get to all of that in a few minutes. Okay, so what technically is considered low carbohydrate? There was a paper published very recently, end of February 2024, by a group of experts that attended this scientific forum on nutrition, wellness, and lower carbohydrate diets. And they highlighted that there isn't a standard definition for low carbohydrate, but they came to a consensus on some definitions that I agree with, and I hope to see them stick moving forward. The acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, AMDR, are established by the national academies as part of the dietary reference intakes. So there's an AMDR for fat, for protein, and for carbs. The AMDR for carbohydrates is between 45 to 65% of total calories. So the dietary guidelines tells us we should aim for between 45 to 65% of our total calories in a day to be from carbohydrates. If we use that standard 2,000 calorie per day diet for reference, and remember, carbohydrates contribute 4 calories energy per gram, 45 to 65% carbohydrate in a 2,000 calorie per day diet would be 225 to 325 grams of carbohydrates per day. And that's actually pretty high. And the consensus among the expert group call this 45 to 65% a high carbohydrate diet. Anything over 65% carbohydrate would be considered a very high carbohydrate diet. They propose carbohydrates in the range of 25 to 45% total calories would be moderate carbohydrate. 10 to 25% is going to be low carbohydrate. And less than 10%, which is going to be where you get into the ketogenic diet, is a very low carbohydrate diet. So to put some numbers to those percentages in grams of carbohydrates, the best way would be for you to calculate it yourself based on your daily caloric needs. I talk about this in episode 1, and we posted a short YouTube tutorial on how to calculate those. But if you want individualized numbers, find your daily caloric needs and then multiply by those different percentages, divide by 4 to get the grams of carbohydrate you would need. We'll use that 2,000 calorie per day example again. So if you're on a 2,000 calorie per day diet and you want to go low carb, which we just defined as 10 to 25% energy from carbohydrates, that's going to be 200 to 500 calories per day from carbs. You divide that by 4 and you get 50 to 125 grams of carbohydrate per day to be considered a low carbohydrate diet. I mentioned we're covering the very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet next episode. So for today, we're looking at these low carbohydrate diets that will have about 50 to 125 grams of carbs, or some are even going to inch into that moderate carbohydrate range, having up to 40% of calories from carbohydrates. Now, we've defined what we mean by low and moderate carbohydrate diets. Let's look at the effects different types of carbohydrates have in our body. Glucose is just another word for blood sugar. We know carbohydrates are either short or long chains of sugars. So anytime you eat foods with carbohydrates in them, your blood sugar is going to increase. Now, how much it increases and how quickly it spikes is going to be dependent on a variety of factors, including how many grams of carbohydrates you consumed, the amounts of simple versus complex carbohydrates, whether you had other macronutrients like protein or fat with those carbs, whether you exercised recently, your insulin sensitivity, a bunch of different factors. But generally speaking, if you consume those simple sugars like table sugar, honey, maple syrup, brown sugar, those things are going to enter your bloodstream very quickly and increase your blood sugar levels quickly. Things that slow down how quickly blood sugar increases are going to be fiber, so consuming natural sugars like those found in fruit that also come with some fiber or fiber-containing foods along with your carbohydrate-containing meal, is going to be better than simple sugars alone. Consuming fat and or protein in addition to those carbs reduces the speed of blood sugar increase because those two macronutrients slow digestion. Now, that's not an exhaustive list, but those are two of the main ones. When you eat a meal or a snack, your body is going to release enzymes that help break that food down into smaller parts it can use for various functions, and it's going to release hormones like insulin based on the response of your body to the food. Insulin, we know, is released in response to an increase in blood sugar, and it's responsible for helping the sugar in your blood get into your cells, mainly your muscle cells, to be used for energy. The more blood sugar increases, the more insulin is released to help get that sugar into the cells. But insulin has other important functions too. Insulin shuts down glucose output by the liver. So normally when you're fasting, your liver releases glucose to keep your blood sugar levels steady. But when you have energy from carbohydrates available that raise blood sugar levels, insulin tells the liver, hey, we don't need your sugar right now. And in fact, you can take some of that sugar from the blood and store it for future use. It also tells fat cells that we don't need to be using stored fat as fuel because we have this readily available blood sugar to use. So it shuts down fat breakdown from fat stores. So insulin helps get sugar out of the blood and into muscle cells and the liver to be used for energy. But insulin can also signal for glucose to be stored in the muscle and liver. The storage form of glucose in the liver and muscle is called glycogen, and this is just long chains of sugar molecules stored to be broken down later for energy. Insulin can also cause some of that sugar to be stored as triglycerides and fat, and it tells the liver to stop providing additional glucose, and it tells the fat tissue stop breaking down fats for energy. So insulin is doing a lot of other things besides just telling your cells to take up blood sugar. You've probably heard the term insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is a hallmark of metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes, and it means the normal responses of muscle, liver, and fat to those effects of insulin we just discussed are not happening properly. To get the muscles to take up the same amount of sugar out of the blood takes more insulin. To get the liver to stop pumping out sugar takes more insulin. The body is becoming resistant to the effects of insulin. And you can imagine then if sugar has a harder time getting from the blood into the cells, and if the liver isn't listening to insulin and it keeps pumping out more sugar into the blood, even though you just ate and you don't need that extra sugar from the liver, sugar is going to back up into the bloodstream and result in higher blood sugar levels, higher blood glucose. When blood sugar keeps staying high, the body thinks, oh, blood sugar's high, I need more insulin. So it pumps out more insulin. But the reason the blood sugar is high in the first place is because the body's not responding properly to the insulin. It's insulin resistant. While this is not an episode on insulin resistance, and our next series of episodes is going to be all about metabolic health, it's important to have that understanding of blood sugar, insulin, and insulin resistance as we move forward, because those are all things that are going to be affected by some of these low carbohydrate approaches. Let's wrap up this section with a few more definitions. Net carbs. You'll hear this term from some of the approaches today, like Atkins. This basically just means you subtract out carbohydrates your body doesn't process and that don't affect blood sugar, like fiber, sugar, alcohols, and allulose. If a packaged food label showed 10 grams of carbohydrates with 5 grams of fiber and 2 grams of sugar alcohols, that would leave you with 3 grams of net carbs. I also want to clarify what people mean when they say you're losing water weight. Many people experience rapid initial weight loss with lower carbohydrate diets, and then you'll hear people say, well, you're just losing water weight. What does this mean, and is it true? One reason more rapid weight loss can occur initially with lower carbohydrate diets is because glycogen, that storage form of sugar in the muscle and liver, attracts water. And for every gram of glycogen you have stored in your muscle or liver, there are about 3 to 4 grams of water hanging around with that glycogen. If you're depleting glycogen stores in your muscles and liver because you go low carbohydrate, you are going to see many pounds of weight loss from this alone. How many will depend on a lot of factors, but I'd say at least 2 and up to 6 pounds for people with high glycogen stores. But you don't just lose the water associated with glycogen when you go low carb. There are a few other mechanisms that cause the body to get rid of water when you decrease carbohydrates. So yes, it's true that much of the initial weight loss you experience when you reduce carbohydrates is going to be from a loss of water. The human body is made up of 50 to 70%-ish water, depending on, again, a lot of factors. So if you're in the higher end of that range, you'll probably see a few more pounds of weight loss early on from losing water. Now, what does this mean longer term? If your goal is to lose weight and you're choosing a low carb approach, that's fine. A low carb approach can be great for people who need to lose some weight and improve metabolic health, as we'll cover in a bit. But understanding that the initial weight loss you experience is mainly due to a loss of water in your body is important for a few reasons. One, it can set expectations too high for future weight loss. If you start a program and you lose 2 or 3 pounds in that first week, another 2 pounds in the second week, you're thinking, this is amazing, a program that finally works. And then week 3 comes and you only lose half pound, and week 4 and then only lose another half pound. People can get discouraged thinking that the program stopped working or they aren't doing it right. But if you understand those first 1 to 2 weeks are going to be a lot of water weight loss, it can set up more realistic expectations. The second has to do with what happens as you add back carbohydrates. Some of the approaches we'll look at today start with a drastic carbohydrate reduction to ketogenic levels under 50 grams a day, and then they slowly add carbohydrates back over time. Doing this is going to result in quick weight loss of that water we just talked about. But as you add back carbohydrates, you'll also add back water. And this can seem like you're either gaining weight back or not losing weight as quickly, which are both more related to the water issue. I highlight this because the psychology of weight loss is powerful. So it's easy for people to put a lot of weight, no pun intended, on the results of the scale. And I think the benefit of low carbohydrate approaches for metabolic health is a much more compelling reason to eat this way than weight loss. The weight loss will come from healthy lifestyle shifts you make, and it'll be sustainable over time with the right approach. That said, let's look at the different existing approaches for lower carbohydrate diets. These are going to be low and moderate carbohydrate options, whereas the ketogenic diet is considered very low carbohydrate, and we're covering that next week. While all of these approaches have the word diet in them, Zone Diet, Atkins Diet, South Beach Diet, they all promote themselves as lifestyles that, yes, you can follow them initially to lose weight and gain other health benefits, but ultimately they're looking for you to follow the principles of the diet long-term as part of a lifestyle. Is it a healthy lifestyle? Well, we'll get into all of that as we review the principles and benefits of each. I'm going to start with the Zone Diet. This is probably the most moderate approach to a lower carbohydrate diet. It was created by a biochemist named Dr. Barry Sears, whose 1995 book, The Zone, was a New York Times #1 bestseller. And Dr. Sears has released many health and diet-related books since then. He's also still an active researcher. The Zone Diet has evolved since that initial book in 1995. So what we talk about today is its present day recommendations. Their website and resources describe the zone as a physiological state where levels of cellular inflammation are balanced. And there are 3 components they promote. First is the Zone Diet itself to reduce dietary sources of inflammation in the body. The second is omega-3 fatty acids, which are important to help regulate proper inflammatory responses. And the third is polyphenols. These are chemicals found in plants that generally have antioxidant effects and also support normal inflammatory levels in the body. They have packaged things they'll sell you for all three of those categories: food, omega-3s, polyphenols. And while I don't recommend buying packaged food if you can avoid it, if you really want to follow the whole zone plan, you could buy omega-3s from them or substitute a high-quality omega-3 supplement from another company. The polyphenol aspect of it, they sell a maqui berry extract, a cacao extract, and one called Sea Health that has polyphenols from a variety of sources in this liquid form. Do you need them? I think polyphenols are great and they can have a lot of health benefits. Maqui berry and cacao in particular have a lot of research behind certain health benefits, but you certainly don't need to pay $20 to $50 a month for these particular supplements. I do think we should all be getting plenty of omega-3 fats, either from several servings of fatty fish per week or from a dietary supplement, but otherwise, supplements like these are completely optional and they're not going to make or break the beneficial effects of following this eating pattern. So why are we talking about the zone diet in a low carbohydrate episode? The original plan focused on a macronutrient distribution of 40-30-30. That's 40% carbohydrates, 30% protein, 30% fat. And since 40% is slightly below that acceptable macronutrient distribution range of carbs that the dietary guidelines recommends, remember they recommend 45 to 65% carbohydrates, this is considered a moderate reduction in carbohydrates from that standard recommendation. But 40% carbohydrate still allows for plenty of healthy foods containing carbohydrates. The zone diet promotes 3 zone meals per day and 1 to 2 snacks, eating a zone meal or snack within 1 hour of waking and never going more than 5 hours during the day without eating a meal or snack. Zone meals should be less than 400 calories, contain at least 25 grams of protein, less than 12 grams of fat, and the carbohydrates should come primarily from non-starchy vegetables with limited amounts from certain fruits and legumes. The lean protein options they give include chicken, fish, turkey, lean beef, egg whites, low-fat dairy, and tofu. They recommend adding a dash of fat from nuts or nut butters, olive oil or avocado, and then choosing your carbohydrates mainly from non-starchy vegetables such as spinach, asparagus, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, and Brussels sprouts. The best fruit option on this plan is berries, and you should aim to limit fruit to 1 to 2 servings per day. The legumes they recommend include black beans, green beans, kidney beans, and garbanzo beans or chickpeas. They have a lot of free downloads on their website that explain all of this in more detail, but that's the gist of it. Aim for 3 meals a day that have about 40% carbohydrate from non-starchy vegetables and some fruits and beans, 30% from lean protein sources, and 30% fat from healthy fats like olive oil, avocados, and nuts like almonds. The zone diet has tried to make this easier by kind of moving away from the 40-30-30 wording and calling them food blocks. So they've defined what counts as a protein block, a fat block, a carbohydrate block, and then you can mix and match these blocks to create a meal. All of that is on their website, and I'll include links directly to the downloads area in the show notes if you're interested more in this. Okay, conclusion on the zone diet then. I think if you're someone who likes or wants to be told exactly what foods to eat and be pretty regimented about it, following the zone diet could be a good option for you. But I don't think all the claims they make about the diet are fully supported by research, which we'll review more in a bit when we talk about the benefits of these diets. I also don't think you need to buy their specific meals or supplements to gain the benefits of a dietary pattern with about 40% carbs, 30% protein, and 30% healthy fats. Next, let's look at the South Beach and the Atkins diet. I'm grouping these because they have some similarities and also because we're not going to spend a ton of time on either of them. Atkins is a lot older than South Beach. Both were created by cardiologist medical doctors, with the Atkins Diet being first published by Dr. Robert Atkins in 1972 and South Beach by Dr. Arthur Agatston in 2003. In fact, it's said that Dr. Agatston was seeing more benefits in his patients following an Atkins-type diet, but he wasn't comfortable with some of the aspects of Atkins like high saturated fat and the limiting of healthful foods like whole grains and fruits. Similar to the Zone diet, both of these approaches have evolved since their initial launches. So what we're talking about today is going to be current versions of these approaches. What are the similarities between South Beach and Atkins? Both have essentially 3 phases: an initial strict phase where you severely restrict carbohydrate intake, an interim phase where you're still losing weight, but you're slowly adding carbohydrate intake back in, and then a maintenance phase of how to eat long-term once you've reached your weight loss goal. So just from that description, you can see both of these were initially targeted for weight loss. The South Beach diet starts with a 2-week, very low carbohydrate phase where you cut out basically all carbs that don't come from non-starchy vegetables. It's very restrictive, but there's not a carb or net carb target. You're just removing nearly all carbohydrate sources from the diet. So it is a ketogenic diet in those terms. They claim the purpose is to eliminate cravings for sugar and refined starches and to jumpstart weight loss, which it will most likely do if you can stick to it. So no fruit, fruit juice, sugar in any form, bread, pasta, rice, cereal, grains, no alcohol, and no starchy vegetables such as potatoes, corn, peas, and squashes. The focus in these 2 weeks is on lean protein sources, high fiber vegetables, low-fat dairy, and foods with healthy, unsaturated fats, including avocados, nuts, and seeds. So it's a pretty healthy eating pattern, but you're missing out on whole grains and fruits. The good news is it's only for 2 weeks. You really wouldn't do this phase if you weren't looking to lose weight. Then you move to phase 2, where you slowly reintroduce the better for you carbohydrates like whole grains, fruits, and some of the starchy vegetables. You're slowly reintroducing the healthy carbs and monitoring how they affect how you feel, your cravings, and your weight. And you're in this phase while you're still needing to lose weight. I'm not going to go into more detail here. If you decide you want to try the South Beach diet after listening to this, your best bet is to buy one of the books. Since the brand was acquired by Nutrisystem in 2015, it kind of seems like Nutrisystem hasn't figured out what it wants to do with South Beach yet. So the websites that are available if you search for South Beach at this point are not great. I'll link to the original and updated book options in the show notes though. They did just launch a keto-friendly version, and we'll touch on that briefly in the next episode. So after you achieve your weight loss goal in phase 1 and phase 2 of the South Beach diet, you maintain in phase 3 by continuing to follow the principles of the plan, keeping to those lean sources of protein, healthy fats, and complex carbohydrates from whole grains, vegetables, and some fruits. There's no set macronutrient distribution or carbohydrate limit. In phase 2, you're figuring out which carbohydrates and amounts allow you to achieve your weight goals, and then you basically stick to that moving forward. The Atkins diet has similarities to the South Beach diet, but in my view is more restrictive, more complicated, and less desirable in terms of overall nutrition. Atkins now has 3 different carb plans to choose from, and you can learn more about them by visiting their website, which I'll also link in the show notes. The levels are Atkins 20, Atkins 40, and Atkins 100, and those tell you the number of net carbs per day you're allowed on each plan. And according to the website, you should start with Atkins 20 if you have more than 40 pounds to lose and you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, with the caveat that you should discuss the dietary change with your doctor. They recommend Atkins 40 if you have less than 40 pounds to lose, and Atkins 100 if you're looking to maintain your weight on a low-carb lifestyle. If you start with Atkins 20, you're going to be in ketosis for the first 2-week phase of the program. This is a 2-week period similar to the South Beach diet where you're going very low carbohydrate. And after that time, you move to about 25 to 50 grams net carbs in phase 2 and start slowly adding prescribed carbohydrate sources back in. Phase 3 graduates you to about 50 to 80 grams net carbs per day, adding back even more options. And then your maintenance phase, or phase 4, is 80 to 100 grams of net carbs per day, still considered a low carbohydrate diet. With Atkins 40, there is not that strict induction phase, although some would argue 40 grams of net carbs is still pretty strict. But there is no point where you go lower than that on Atkins 40. You just start the plan following their recommendations to hit 40 grams of net carbs per day from foundation vegetables and your other carb sources that you're allowed. And then you follow their recommendations for protein and fats. When you're within 10 pounds of your goal weight on that plan, you're going to start adding back 10 grams of net carbs per week. So if you start at 180 pounds and your goal is to get to 160 pounds, to lose 20 pounds, right? It says when you're within 10 pounds of your goal weight, you're going to add 10 grams of net carbs. So when you get to 170 pounds, you're within 10 pounds of your goal weight, 160, right? You're going to add 10 grams of net carbs for a week. So instead of eating 40 grams net carbs, you bump up to 50 grams, and you're monitoring how your body responds to that. Again, not going to go into the exact details of here. If you're interested in Atkins, check out the resources I provide to help you choose your exact plan. But that's the Atkins 40, and that's the gist of how you would follow it. One of the shifts Atkins has appeared to make from the original 1970s book is to limit saturated fats and fat servings per day, focusing on healthier fat sources, though you can still have fats like butter on this plan. So I do feel like they've made a positive shift towards more healthy fats, although you're still allowed some of those less desirable fats in terms of saturated fat content. I'm actually not sure with regard to the South Beach diet if they're still selling packaged foods or not through any channels. I know the new Keto South Beach version has products for sale, but Atkins will sell you any number of processed food products that are Atkins approved. And if you decide to try either of the plans on Atkins, you can investigate these options, but avoiding the processed food options is going to be a much healthier approach to these diets if possible. Ultra-processed foods, which is what these are, despite them being planned approved, are just not good for you. Following these plans using whole food options of vegetables, lean proteins, approved carbohydrates, and healthy fats is going to give you the healthiest results possible. All right. The last of the branded, if you will, low carbohydrate approaches we're talking about today is called the slow carb diet. And this is a plan proposed by Tim Ferriss in his book, The 4-Hour Body, though he has no nutrition background or credentials, just to point that out. I mention it here because it was on the New York Times bestseller list and it's been featured on popular podcasts like his own podcast, The Tim Ferriss Show, and the Huberman Lab podcast. Since it is considered low carbohydrate based on the foods it restricts, I wanted to mention it, but I'm not as familiar with it as I am with some of these more established ones that we've covered. The slow carb diet has some basic rules. 1, avoid white and starchy carbohydrates. This will be your simple carbohydrates like sugar, as well as bread, pasta, rice, potatoes. Even if they're whole grain, you're avoiding it. 2, eat the same meals over and over again, and those are going to be composed of a vegetable, beans or lentils, and a protein. 3, don't drink calories. So basically no fruit juice, milk, caloric soda, etc., although there is an exception for red wine, which I find somewhat interesting. 4 is don't eat fruit at least 6 days per week. And 5, take 1 day off per week to eat whatever you want. Now, that last one might sound fun, but there's a few potential issues with a cheat day. One, it can really promote binge-like eating, which may be fine for some people, but this is not a good idea for anyone with a tendency to binge eat, eating a lot of food in a short window. I mean, the very definition of binge eating disorder, which is the most common eating disorder in the US, is that binge eating episodes typically occur at least once a week for 3 months. So if you go crazy on this cheat day once a week for several months, you now meet the definition of an eating disorder. If you believe you could follow this approach and simply enjoy a few extra foods in moderation that you can't eat during the week, then something like this might work for you. But that's my main beef with this one. The other consideration is that eating well throughout the entire week and then eating whatever you want in whatever portions you want for one day can really wreak havoc on your digestive system. We talked in episode 3 on fasting about how your circadian rhythms adjust to your eating schedule. Your system is also adjusted to the types of foods you consume and how much of them you consume. So you could have some very unpleasant side effects with this binging approach one day a week. That said, this approach is not like some of the others where you're counting carbohydrates or aiming for a certain macronutrient distribution. It's low carbohydrate simply based on what all it cuts out, which are simple sugars and even most complex carbohydrates like fruit and grains, even whole grains. You're left with protein, vegetables, and beans or lentils to eat. So you are getting carbohydrates from the beans and lentils and perhaps a little from the vegetables, but it's still a pretty low carbohydrate approach. I'm not aware of any scientific studies that have been done using this approach, so it's basically an influencer diet with no scientific backing or safety data. It would not be at the top of my list as a recommendation, but reducing simple carbohydrates, focusing on adding beans and lentils to your meals, lean protein and vegetables, it's not the worst advice, which leads me to my final point about all of these low carbohydrate approaches. We're about to get into the various health benefits of lower carbohydrate diets, and there do seem to be many reasons why reducing carbohydrates, particularly those simple carbohydrates that don't come with additional nutrients and fiber, are going to be beneficial for you. Do you gain true long-term benefit from doing a short-term, highly restrictive jumpstart like we see in the Atkins or South Beach diet? It doesn't seem so. Do you gain true benefits from buying the packaged foods and snacks these companies want to sell you? I'd say the opposite is true. The more you can avoid processed packaged foods, even if they're Zone or Atkins or South Beach approved, the better. Instead, taking the general principles from the Zone diet of higher protein, healthy fats, and a slight reduction in carbohydrates, focusing on getting your carbs from complex carbohydrates, which we also see in the maintenance phase of Atkins and South Beach, is going to be a better general approach, and it saves you the pain of having to stick with an incredibly restrictive diet for several weeks or months, when the results at 6 months to a year out are going to be pretty similar if you simply follow a more moderate approach. So why put yourself through the pain? Let's look at what the research shows with regard to health benefits of these different approaches and reduced carbohydrates in general. If you follow Zone, Atkins, South Beach, or just reduce your intake of simple carbohydrates, you're most likely going to lose some weight, both initially and in the longer term. Remember, one thing we already talked about was the loss of water weight that happens quickly when you cut carbohydrates from your diet. And yes, that water weight will come back as you start to add more carbohydrates back to your diet, but you can still lose weight long term with these approaches that's going to be true weight loss, like weight and fat loss from your body. Reviews and meta-analyses show the Atkins diet may be slightly superior to the Zone diet in terms of weight loss at 6 months, with people losing about 12 to 22 pounds with Atkins and 9 to 18 pounds with Zone. There are some studies to indicate the South Beach diet is also very effective for weight loss, but there's much less data on this approach compared to Atkins. However, given the similarities between those two diets, it's likely that many of the positive outcomes of Atkins would also be seen with the South Beach approach. Basically, if your goal is to lose weight in the 3 to 12 month term, any of these approaches can work, but the results are not going to be much different compared to following a low fat diet with similar calorie restriction, at least simply for weight loss. But weight is not the full picture of metabolic health, right? There was a really interesting study in 24 men and women with obesity and prediabetes who were provided all of their meals for a 6-month period. And they either consumed the 40% carbohydrate, 30% protein, 30% fat pattern that the zone diet is based on, or a high carbohydrate pattern of 55% carbs, 15% protein, and 30% fat. So the fat was the same in both patterns. The differences were in carbohydrates and protein. And they were reduced by about 500 calories per day from their energy needs to promote 1 to 2 pounds of weight loss per week. So what they found was after 6 months on this calorie-reduced diet, all 12 subjects, 100% of the people in the 40-30-30 group, that pattern that was similar to the zone diet, were no longer classified as pre-diabetic, whereas only a third in the high carb group were no longer classified as pre-diabetic. So both groups lost close to 10% of their body weight, and there was no difference in weight loss between the two groups. They both had significant differences in fat mass as well, but really importantly, the high carb group lost lean mass, so lean muscle mass, and this is not something that we want to see with weight loss. Maintaining lean muscle mass is important for a lot of reasons, and they actually saw an increase in muscle mass in the 40-30-30 higher protein group. The higher protein group also had greater reductions in HbA1c, that measure of long-term glucose levels, and indices of insulin resistance like HOMA-IR and the insulin sensitivity index. They saw greater reductions in triglyceride and LDL cholesterol levels and greater reductions in inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6. The way they defined remission of prediabetes in the study was by standard definitions of fasting blood glucose level cutoffs for prediabetes and the 2-hour glucose level following an oral glucose tolerance test, also called an OGTT. In an oral glucose tolerance test, you take a fasting blood sample for blood glucose, and then you give the person a glucose drink with 75 grams of glucose, and you take blood samples every 30 minutes for 2 hours. And while both groups improved their responses to this oral glucose tolerance test after 6 months on the diet, the 40-30-30 higher protein group had greater improvements in this test. In a separate publication about the same study, they showed greater increases in the incretin hormone GLP-1, which stimulates insulin secretion in response to food, and GIP, which inhibits another hormone called glucagon. Now, we don't need to get into the mechanisms, but interest in GLP-1 has exploded since the Ozempic craze because Ozempic and similar drugs work by activating the GLP-1 receptor. This study shows the 40-30-30 macronutrient pattern with weight loss after 6 months. It increased GLP-1 levels after the oral glucose drink, and it increased GLP-1 levels after a test meal compared to the high carbohydrate diet. They also saw decreases after these tests in the hunger hormone called ghrelin, which suggests that higher protein diet would result in less detectable hunger in those subjects, though they didn't measure subjective hunger ratings in this study. So while this study was still small in terms of numbers, it included both men and women. It was actually quite a high percentage African-American participants, and it was a well-controlled study where food was provided for 6 months, which is really challenging and expensive to do. To me, this study demonstrates a lot of what we already know, which is for calorie-matched diets, weight loss is going to be pretty comparable. But higher protein diets are better at preserving that lean muscle mass that's important. And it's likely one of the reasons why the higher protein group had better insulin sensitivity and glucose tolerance, because muscle is a major tissue for glucose uptake. Blood pressure and total cholesterol were lower in both groups and were not different between groups. But a few other cardiovascular risk factors like triglycerides and LDL cholesterol were more reduced in the higher protein group, as were those inflammatory cytokines. So this study really highlights some positive benefits for the zone macronutrient distribution of 40% carb, 30% protein, 30% fat, compared to more typical and higher carbohydrate distributions. And really, the good news here is that it's not a huge reduction in carbohydrates. You're really just swapping some simple carbohydrates for more protein, and that's a change I think a lot of people can get on board with. The takeaway from this study and others like it is while weight loss may be comparable on various dietary approaches, that's not all that matters. The metabolic health outcomes like blood pressure, blood lipids, insulin sensitivity, lean mass retention, and the like are actually of greater health impact than simply the number on the scale. So that was one study looking at higher protein, lower carbohydrate approaches. What does the aggregate data on other health outcomes for low carbohydrate diets show? That recent publication by the group of experts in the field, they say low carbohydrate diets show better overall HDL or good cholesterol and triglyceride levels in studies of 6 to 12 months when compared to low fat diets. But low fat diets had better outcomes for total and LDL cholesterol. If you look at even longer term, up to 24 months, and in overweight and obese individuals, they found similar results that low carb diets showed better outcomes for HDL cholesterol and triglycerides, while low fat diets were better for reducing total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. All of these are risk factors for cardiovascular disease, but there's some debate over which markers are the most predictive of disease or death. And there's an equation to predict the risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, basically your risk of having a heart attack or stroke in the next 10 years. Results from aggregating all of these studies show both a low carb or low fat diet in overweight and obese people can decrease your 10-year risk score, but the risk reduction was greater with low carbohydrate diets. Overall, the pooled results point to a potential for a slight edge of low carbohydrate diets over low fat diets for cardiovascular disease risk, though both can improve different risk markers related to blood lipids. Keep in mind, we're still talking about what we would consider low or moderately low carbohydrate diets here. These results do not include very low carb diets like the ketogenic diet, which we'll cover next week. I also left out some studies that I found interesting, but I didn't feel represented the entirety of the current evidence. For example, one study of the 40-30-30 pattern found impressive improvements in fasting insulin and measures of insulin sensitivity after 9 days on that eating pattern compared to a Mediterranean diet. But it was a small study and it was only 9 days, which is obviously very short. Other short-term studies in the 4 to 8 week range show some improvement in fasting blood glucose and HbA1c, but the longer studies and the meta-analyses have not shown meaningful differences versus other types of diets for changes in fasting blood glucose, HbA1c, and insulin levels. So what's the takeaway here? Whether you're aiming to lose weight or not, you'll probably lose a few pounds simply by reducing carbohydrate intake because of that water weight mechanism we talked about. If you follow one of the low carb approaches we've discussed and reduce your calories, you'll likely lose weight, and that weight loss may be greater in the short term compared to other approaches. But by about 6 months to a year, results are going to be pretty similar no matter which diet you choose. Low carb diets may, however, help you maintain more lean muscle mass as you lose weight, which is really important for other metabolic health outcomes. The jury is still out on whether non-ketogenic low carbohydrate diets have benefits for blood sugar control long term. But no matter what, we know that shifting from those simple carbohydrates to complex carbohydrates that contain fiber and break down more slowly is going to be better for blood sugar control and insulin resistance. There are some interesting study results, such as the well-controlled feeding study that looked at that 40-30-30 distribution of carbs, fat, and protein. But meta-analyses that group existing clinical data have failed to show major differences so far. All in all, following a lower carbohydrate approach that limits simple carbs and promotes complex carbohydrates is not going to be any worse than something like a higher carb, low fat approach, but it very well may have important metabolic and long-term health benefits. So in my view, these patterns are preferable when carbs are reduced moderately and they're well designed to include important nutrients. I want to shift gears to potential nutrient shortfalls and other watch-outs for these eating patterns before we wrap up. Like almost any eating pattern, there's certainly ways to make a low-carb diet unhealthy, just like you can make a vegetarian pattern or intermittent fasting unhealthy, right? With all of these food patterns we're reviewing, the goal should always be to make them as healthful as possible. So some things to watch out for low carbohydrate approaches are going to be your fat sources, where you get the carbs that you do eat, your fiber amounts, and certain vitamins and minerals. Remember, the original Atkins diet didn't particularly restrict which fats you could have. This was a common criticism with low carbohydrate diets that promote a philosophy of eat whatever you want as long as it doesn't have a lot of carbs in it. Many of those options are going to be high in saturated fats, which, despite debate on the topic that we can get into next week, saturated fats are associated with increased LDL cholesterol levels and therefore cardiovascular disease risk. Focusing your protein sources on leaner options like poultry and your fat sources to beneficial options like fatty fish for the omega-3s, olive oil, and whole foods like avocado, nuts, and seeds are going to be better options. The same goes for carbohydrates. If you're following a low-carb diet, but you choose to get your allowed grams of carbs from simple sugars versus complex options, you're going to end up with a low-fiber diet. And we know fiber is important for helping with cholesterol levels, satiety, blood sugar, digestion, and more. So a well-designed low-carbohydrate diet focuses on complex carb sources that are going to provide important additional nutrients and fiber compared to those simple carbs. Because low-carb diets tend to cut out or limit fruits, whole grains, starchy vegetables, and even sometimes nuts and seeds for periods of time, ensuring that you get adequate vitamins and minerals is also a consideration. You can take a multivitamin to ensure that you're not missing out on important nutrients, but some of the top ones that have been identified in studies of low-carb diets are vitamin C, vitamin B1, folate, magnesium, calcium, and iron. If you're consuming varied meats, fish, leafy greens, and cruciferous vegetables, you're probably going to be okay for most of those. Calcium can be harder because dairy is such a high source of it, but you can consume lower carb dairy options like cheeses and cottage cheese over milk. I think the risk of not getting enough of most of these nutrients is pretty low, especially if you're going the whole food-based route when following these plans. What's going to be more common on very low carbohydrate diets like a ketogenic diet are mineral deficiencies. Very low carb diets have a diuretic effect, causing the body to lose water. And when you lose water, you lose minerals like sodium, potassium, and magnesium as well. Again, less likely on these more moderate low carb approaches we're talking about today, but in a period of severe carb restriction, like those first few weeks of the South Beach or Atkins, if you do those restrictive ones, you may experience this loss of minerals, which can lead to many negative symptoms people often describe as the keto flu. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Lastly, packaged processed foods is another one to watch out for on these plans. Just because something is Zone or Atkins or South Beach branded or it has a low amount of carbohydrates doesn't mean it's good for you. Many of these are going to be highly processed junk, and you're much better off just eating whole, real food. So this leads us to our next section about side effects, risks, and contraindications. These ultra-processed, low-carb products often add fiber to reduce net carbs and/or sugar alcohols, which don't raise blood sugar or have as many calories as regular sugar. Either of these in high amounts can cause digestive issues such as gas, bloating, cramps, diarrhea. So you'll want to be careful if you see ingredients like inulin, chicory root fiber, polydextrose, sorbitol, erythritol, xylitol, things that end in that OL, those are sugar alcohols. These are commonly added and can really jack up your stomach if you're not used to them or if you eat too much in one sitting or a day. One way to avoid that is to avoid these low-carb packaged foods that contain them. I also mentioned keto flu a moment ago, and we'll go into that in more detail on next week's episode. But this can occur when you're in those very low-carb phases of less than 50 grams per day. Common symptoms can include fatigue, decreased energy, headaches, irritability, difficulty focusing or brain fog, dizziness, nausea, and you know what that sounds like to me? It sounds like hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. So especially if you have a history of low blood sugar or you're on glucose-lowering medications, it's important to have a way to determine if you're truly hypoglycemic in those instances so that you can address it, or if they're just symptoms of this mineral deficiency or keto flu. This goes back to what we've mentioned many times in the series about discussing dietary changes with a medical professional, either your doctor prescribing the medications or a registered dietitian as part of your healthcare plan. They're going to be able to assess your individual situation and needs and make sure you can follow whatever dietary plan is best for you in a safe way. But if these symptoms are solely due to the reduction in carbohydrate and the physiological effects that can have outside of hypoglycemia, such as loss of electrolytes like sodium, potassium, magnesium, supplementing to replace those electrolytes and drinking more fluids can help. Suddenly dropping most carbs out of your diet can also be a shock to your system. So one way to reduce negative side effects from that is to slowly reduce your carbohydrate intake over several weeks before making that more drastic cut. Similarly, after you've been on a low carbohydrate pattern for several days, suddenly consuming a high carb meal, such as if you did a cheat day and ate all the donuts one morning, that's going to be a shock to your system, and you're likely going to have some negative digestive effects, not to mention a horrible spike in blood sugar and insulin that your body is not expecting. If you're going to add carbohydrates back in after a period of low carbohydrate, introduce back lower impact carbohydrates, such as those complex carbs, either in slightly greater amounts or greater frequency in a day, and do it slowly over a few weeks. If you do eat something with lots of simple carbohydrates, at least aim to have it after you've already consumed some fiber, protein, and fat to lessen that effect on blood sugar and insulin. And moving your body in the form of exercise or walking can also help your body process that unexpected sugar. We've talked a lot in previous episodes about condition-specific considerations for changing your diet and why it's really important to discuss any changes you want to make with a qualified healthcare provider. I say qualified because, to be honest, many medical doctors don't have much nutrition training. However, they are going to be the ones that are prescribing drugs to you, so they should know how a certain approach, like a low carbohydrate diet, may affect that drug. Some of the key ones to keep in mind are going to be anyone on medication to lower blood sugar. Basically, if you're on insulin, starting to eat less sugar in your diet will affect the dose of insulin you need. So you're at risk of your blood sugar going too low if you stay at the same dose of insulin, but you're not consuming as much carbohydrate, as much sugar. If you're losing weight on any of these approaches, your blood pressure is also probably going to decrease. So if you're on blood pressure medication, you need to coordinate with your doctor so your blood pressure doesn't drop too low. We've talked about why people with kidney stones, later stage kidney disease, and those on drugs like warfarin have to be careful with dietary changes, even healthy dietary changes, because certain nutrients or compounds found in plants can exacerbate these conditions. And I refer you back to episodes 2 through 4 for those. You can find the timestamps for contraindications on those episodes for more information. For pregnant and nursing women, these diets are not recommended. Certainly not the very low carb ketogenic approaches, but even more moderate reductions below the 45% standard recommendation are not recommended by most health organizations and professional associations, likely due to potential lack of certain micronutrients that can be critical for fetal development. If you're looking for more specific guidance on this, I'll add a link in the show notes where you can find a registered dietitian in your area to work with, and you can narrow that down by searching for the specialty in pregnancy and breastfeeding within the registered dietitian list. Lastly, if you have food sensitivities, allergies, or aversions to certain foods that are a large part of one of these approaches, you should probably look for different options. Example, if you're really sensitive to eating beans or lentils, and every time you do, your stomach bloats up like a balloon, and you've even tried consuming things like digestive enzymes, and that doesn't help, you probably shouldn't try the slow carb diet where legumes is one of the 3 categories of foods that you're supposed to choose from. If you want to be all or mostly plant-based and you don't plan to include either fish or eggs, it's going to be a challenge to get enough protein and overall nutrients on these low-carb approaches, since you can't have too much dairy and you can't have too much legumes because those contain carbohydrates if you're going low-carb, unless you're ovo-vegetarian, lacto-ovo, or pescatarian. It's not that plant-based is impossible, but it will take a lot of nutrition knowledge or individual guidance and planning to be successful on a low-carb plant-based diet. Okay, is it just me or is this episode really long? It's always my goal to cover as much relevant information as possible, but not to get so deep in the weeds that the episode becomes many hours long. I hope I achieved that goal today in talking about these different low carbohydrate eating approaches, and we'll take a quick summary lap here to wrap it up. The dietary guidelines tells us we should aim for between 45 to 65% of our total calories to be carbohydrates. So using a standard 2,000 calorie per day diet for reference, that's going to be 225 to 325 grams of carbohydrates per day. An expert consensus group labeled this as high carbohydrate and instead defined moderate carbohydrate as 25 to 45% carb and low carbohydrate as 10 to 25% carb. Very low carbohydrate diets like a ketogenic diet are going to be below 10% of your total calories from carbs, or about 20 to 50 grams of carbohydrates per day. And we will be talking more about those very low carbohydrate diets in next week's episode. The patterns we reviewed today fall in the low and moderate carbohydrate ranges, between about 50 to 200 grams of carbs per day, with some like the South Beach and Atkins promoting an initial period where you are very low carbohydrate. That's going to put you into ketosis for a short amount of time. And then we had others like the Zone Diet that are more straightforward and promote balanced meals of about 40% carbs, 30% protein, 30% fat in each meal and each snack. While there are scientific studies on some of these specific approaches, the pooled data suggest lower carb diets can be effective for weight loss, but they're not necessarily any more effective than other types of diets. That's why people say the best diet is the one that you'll stick to. However, the data is building for additional metabolic benefits on lower carb approaches, including slight advantages potentially for glucose control, insulin sensitivity, appetite control, and cardiovascular disease risk factors. My informed opinion after reviewing excessive amounts of information on this topic is yes, it's probably beneficial for most of us to reduce our carbohydrate intake, particularly from simple carbs and processed foods, and replace them with high quality protein and healthy fats instead. Even moderate reductions in carbohydrate intake can have beneficial effects, and this seems even more evident in people who are already experiencing some metabolic disturbances, such as excess weight, rising fasting blood glucose numbers, prediabetes, or type 2 diabetes. However, I don't think you necessarily need to follow one of these more stringent approaches, particularly the ketogenic phases of South Beach or Atkins, to gain similar benefits you'll see simply by eating a healthy, lower carb pattern over time. Some people like to be told exactly what foods to eat, and in that case, I'd probably recommend the Zone over those others due to the fact that it promotes a moderate decrease in carbohydrates, and they have a lot of free tools and resources on their website. Well, I hope you learned something new today. I hope you have enough information to decide if you might want to try one of these approaches out, and that you have the tools to take the next steps when you're ready. Please leave any questions or comments you have about this episode in the comments section of our YouTube channel. You can find us at Nuchi Health, that's NUCHI Health, there and on all social platforms. And if you learned something helpful or enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on our social accounts, and leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. Those interactions help us grow and help us make a bigger impact. I've also linked my Ko-fi page in the show notes where you can make a contribution to the show if you'd like to support us in that way. Thank you for being here, for your desire to learn and improve your health, and for letting us be part of that health journey. I'll see you soon.